welcome to St Dunstan's Church as well as to the election hustings on this particularly beautiful, warm evening. I probably don't need to do this, but it would be odd if I didn't, so I'll introduce you to the candidates. Starting from my left, this is going in alphabetical order of surname. We have Dave Ash, who represents the National Health Action Party. And then we have Emily Brothers of the Labour Party, Paul Burstow for the Lib Dems, and then Angus Dalgleish for UKIP, Pauline Gorman of the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition, Paul Scully for the Conservatives, and Maeve Tomlinson for the Green Party. And many of you won't be able to see him perhaps, but over to your left there is a gentleman called Matt Hussey who is filming the proceedings in order that they may be used to encourage young people into political interest. Now, there will be people who don't know who I am, perhaps, although you might be able to guess something about me. My name is Chairman, although I'm also known as Father Lorne, and I'm a team vicar in this parish. Now, of course, time is of the essence. We want to be finished by 9:30, so I'm going to explain to you how things will work. I hope. I'm sure they will work perfectly like this, and refresh the memories of the candidates as far as the running order goes. In a moment, I'll invite the candidates to give a short speech where they'll go in alphabetical order of party. We'll hear from each candidate separately for 2 to 3 minutes. After that, you'll have the opportunity to put a question simply for an answer from one candidate. And that, of course, will not involve a great deal of time for each candidate. 2.5 minutes is the time again I've thought of for that. There may be one, there may be 2 questions, but for each candidate, that time to answer questions just for themselves. And for that, I'll be calling the candidates in alphabetical order by name, their surnames. And after that, we come to the more ordinary part of proceedings these days, I think, whenever people gather for something political, and that is questions where everybody has a shot at answering. And each of the first couple of sections will last, I anticipate, about 20 minutes. This last will last about 40 minutes. We'll see how many questions we get through. I've used a 57-year-old computer in order to produce a complicated algorithm so that we have different orders of answering for each question that's put. But do start thinking about that. And I should tell you that when we come to questions from the floor, I'm not intending there to be any roving mic running around, because it always seems to take up more time than one would like. We don't, as far as I can see, have many children running around making a lot of noise or any other background interference, so I'm sure you'll be able to make yourself heard. If, when we get to asking questions, if you'd like to ask a question, then please just stand up, and if I call you, then please stay standing, put your question. If you don't, please sit down again. And for the sake of fairness, I will just identify people by some sort of description, as you hear David Dimbleby doing. Now, I think that's all I needed to say in advance, except for one thing, which may be the most important. If anybody needs to use the lavatory, go out of the south door, that's the one you must have come in by, and follow the building round to your left, and you'll come to another door, and up a slight ramp, and if you open that door, you'll find a toilet on your left, possibly one on your right as well, again. So, we start the proceedings now formally, and we have, please, Paul Scully speaking for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Father Lorne. Yes, as you say, I'm Paul Scully. I have been living in the borough now for 28 years. First of all in the middle of Sutton and latterly in Carshalton. I was a local councillor here in Carshalton, and then the leader of the Conservative group on Sutton Council. Some of you I may have met over that period of time. And in my background, over 20 years, I'm not a career politician. It's not something particular I went into any view to actually having a career in politics. I've run my own business over a number of years. I run a communications company. And I think actually it's having that sort of background in life, when you're actually responsible for other people's livelihoods, when you've actually been through a couple of recessions. I've lost a business in a recession as well as actually opened up a second one, slightly madly, in a recession. That you actually start to understand the realities and the difficulties of life. Over the last 2.5 years since I've been the parliamentary candidate for Sutton and Cheam, I started right at the beginning, and my 3 themes haven't really changed because they're 3 local themes that reflect what's going on in the country as a whole. National Health Service, obviously protecting the accident and emergency services, the maternity services, the children's services at St Helier Hospital, the hospital where my 2 children were born, where I volunteer on a regular basis in the stroke ward as well. It's always been there for me, it's always been there for us as a borough, and it's really important that we're there for the hospital in its hour of need. But also protecting some sort of healthcare facilities at Sutton Hospital as well. Preferably, I'd love to see a decent healthcare facility like a super surgery built there to take the pressure off St Helier for blood tests, minor procedures, these sort of things. I'd also like to see the council get on and build a secondary school to satisfy the shortage of school places that they predict are likely to happen by 2017, and we're likely to need a second secondary school by 2020 as well. The demand at the moment is in the centre of Sutton and to the north of Sutton, and that's really where I'd like to see sites being identified and a school being built over there. And the third thing is the local economy as well. It's fantastic when you see David Cameron and George Osborne talking about the economy as a whole. We've got the fastest growing economy in the developed world, creating more jobs than the whole of the rest of the European Union put together, but we need to see how that affects us here as well. So I've been doing a lot of work with the local independent shops, making sure that the character of Cheam, the character of Worcester Park, North Cheam are developed and maintained as well, so we can have thriving high streets, and then we can have a vision for Sutton High Street as well. But at the end of the day, this is a national election. When David Cameron needs 23 more seats to win an overall majority, this is number 17. So you have a huge influence about who runs the country for the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And the second speaker is Maeve Tomlinson for the Green Party, please.
Hello, my name is Maeve Tomlinson, and I'm the candidate for the Green Party in Sutton and Cheam. And thank you for inviting me and having the opportunity to speak today. I would just like to say that I've lived in the area for most of my life, so that's about 30 years. And also what the Green Party stand for is imagine a political system that puts the public first. Imagine an economy that gives everyone their fair share. Imagine a society capable of supporting everyone's needs. And imagine a planet protected from the threats of climate change now and for the generations to come. That's the world we want to create, and we believe we have the means to do it. In Sutton, I'm concerned about the incinerators being built in Beddington on the Metropolitan Open Land, and I support the Stop the Incinerator campaign. And our Green Party candidate for North Croydon has taken the court case out in his name with support from the local communities fundraising for his cause. I'm also a member of Keep Sutton Cycling, which is a London cycling campaign group, and also for Sutton to keep our NHS public. So another main call for me for the Green Party is ending the charade called austerity, which is leading to the gap between rich and poor expanding. And in the Western world, we actually have the largest inequality. So wages are lowering, and we have a working poor who have to rely on benefits to supplement their income, even though we are the 5th wealthiest country in the world, and yet there are many relying on food banks even. So I support the Green Party for the common good. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And I would now like to ask Emily Brothers to speak for the Labour Party. I should have said thank you to Maeve just then, I'm sure.
All right, okay, thanks.
Emily.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm Emily Brothers. I'm from the Labour Party. I've lived in Sutton now for 25 years, have 2 children who were born at St Helier Hospital and educated in local state schools. I have found my time in Sutton to be tremendous, and I welcome the opportunity to represent the community of which I have been welcomed over the last 25 years. Labour is about change and not about conserving the status quo for the privileged few. That is what I'm committed to deliver as your prospective Labour Member of Parliament, if elected. I'm committed, as is the Labour Party nationally, to economic strong foundations. That's about balancing the bucks. It's about taking effective measures to reduce the deficit, but to do it in a fair way, a recovery that everybody can share in rather than just the privileged few. We want to see higher living standards, so that is tackling gas and electricity bills that people find difficult to pay. So we will regulate the market. We will also increase the national minimum wage to £8 and ban 0-hour contracts. No more of the cost of living crisis that has been brought about due to austerity. Labour, at the core of what we do, is about the NHS. So we will invest in a time to care fund of £2.5 billion to pay for 20,000 more nurses and 8,000 more GPs, and a plethora of other measures we will bring in too to support our NHS. We'll also bring in fair controls on immigration, and the way to tackle the fears about immigration, in our view, is about tackling the 0-hour contract culture and low-wage economy. That's what we're committed to do. But also giving hope to the next generation by bringing in measures such as a vocational baccalaureate for young people. We will reduce tuition fees from 9,000 to 6,000. We will invest in the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Paul Burstow.
Thank you very much, and can I start by just saying the chair claps behind me, and start by thanking you, Father Long, for organising this evening, and all of you for turning up to take part in this Hustings event. I look forward to your questions. I've had the privilege and honour of being your Member of Parliament now for the last 18 years and working with many of you on many of the issues that make me believe this is a great place to live and a great place to bring up a family. I was born at St Helier Hospital. I've lived here 53 years. We're competing on years, it seems, at the moment. And my children, all three of them, were born at the hospital as well and go to local schools. And those schools are one of the great assets we have in this borough. It's one of the things that makes people want to move here. It's one of the things that makes people want to stay here. It's why I started to raise some years ago the need to make sure we had sufficient primary school places. As the birth rate went up, we secured the resources, we've expanded the primary schools, and now we're starting to do the same for our high schools to make sure that there are places available. And it was really good news this year that 97% of parents secured the school of their choice when it came to high school allocations. A really good result, the best in London, a product of a team effort between a local council and local Liberal Democrat members of Parliament. In terms of other issues, the health service always is my priority. It's why I've campaigned with others, and particularly the local authority, to oppose the proposals to close the accident and emergency unit and maternity units, and why I will continue to pursue those issues during the next Parliament. But we also need to focus on the economy, both nationally, internationally and locally. And locally I've been working to make sure that we attract additional investment into this borough, and over the last 5 years we've seen £350 million of new investment coming in, new jobs, new opportunities. And we have in our borough a hidden gem, the Institute for Cancer Research, which also are now looking to expand and develop. And I think that gives us great opportunities for science-based growth in this area. But it's not just about local issues, although I am passionate about them as a local resident. It is also about what we can do nationally. And over the last 5 years, both as a minister and as a backbench member of Parliament, I've pursued my passions, which are about how we improve the quality of care in this country, and particularly have been able to overhaul the law governing social care in this country, make sure that we have a fairer system fit for the 21st century, doubled the investment that's going into dementia research, outlawed age discrimination in the NHS, and made sure that mental health gets the priority it deserves. It's a shaming fact that in this country, mental health until this last few years did not have the same legal standing as physical health. That's changed, there's more to do, and I'm now going to draw my remarks to a close so that we can get on with the questions. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Dave Ash of the NHA.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Father Lawrence and Dunstan's Church for hosting the event, and of course all of you who've come along this evening. I'm Dave Ash, and I'm the parliamentary candidate for the National Health Action Party in Sutton and Cheam, the 7th of May general election. The National Health Action Party was set up in the wake of the coalition government's NHS reforms, specifically the Health and Social Care Act 2012, an act with which Mr Burstow should be very familiar, as it was he who guided this Tory bill's passage through Parliament. This act represented the biggest top-down reorganisation of the NHS since it was founded in 1948. None of the electorate in 2010 knew that the people they elected would be pushing through these earth-shattering reforms. No party prior to the general election in 2010 had even mentioned it in their manifesto, and it didn't feature in the coalition agreement. This wicked act, in its very first clause, removed the responsibility from the Health Secretary to provide you with a national health service. Were the politicians who pushed this through acting in your best interest when they did so? It also opened up the NHS to privatisation like never before, forcing the NHS to put contracts out to tender to any qualified provider, and in many cases, those very companies decide to offshore their profits to minimise their tax bill. Again, were they acting in your best interest when they did so? It's also massively increased the amount of private work which NHS Foundation Trusts can carry out in NHS property which you and I have paid for over the years, and in the case of PFI property, will be paying for forever. Your best interests? And now the spectre of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership looms large. This trade agreement has the capacity to make the privatisation of our public services, including the NHS, irreversible. All of the main parties are apparently in favour of TTIP, although Labour have made some noises suggesting they would somehow exempt the NHS, which is something which lots of research suggests is not possible. I believe that every party of government over the last 30 years or so have played their part in the destruction of our public services, including the NHS. The Tories started the fire by privatising things like British Gas and hospital cleaning services, and with the introduction of the Private Finance Initiative. Then Labour stoked the fire with an explosion of PFIs and opened up a bit more of the NHS to private companies, and now the Tory and Lib Dem coalition have poured petrol on the fire. The recurrent theme here is the wholesale moving of public money into private pockets. Well, I say this must be stopped and reversed now. Public services, including the NHS, are not the property of whichever shade of government is in power at any given time. They are not theirs to sell because they belong to all of us. I think it's long overdue that we have a few politicians in Parliament who are going to actually do what they're elected to do. Represent the people who elect them and fight to retain and improve what is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And the next speaker, please, is Pauline Gorman from the Trade Union Socialist Coalition.
Thank you, Father Lord. I've only been living in Sutton for 25 years. Never mind. TUSC is you may never have heard of it. It's a very new party, and this is our first time fielding candidates in the parliamentary elections. I heartily endorse absolutely everything that David Ash has said, and I suppose we might split the vote here. But what he said is absolutely true. And Maeve was right when she said that we're the 5th wealthiest country in the world. But there are absolute anomalies in our society that are absolutely horrendous. We have 1 in 10 households unable to feed their children properly. We have 3 food banks in Sutton with 1 million people nationwide going to food banks. I have recently, I won't go into the story, heard of a teacher who had to go to a food bank. We have 700,000 people on 0 hours contracts. We have public service closures left, right and centre, and lots more looming because the 3 main parties voted in January for £30 billion cuts. So we've got 1 in 10 libraries have already closed. There's a vicious attitude, while sort of feathering the nest of the millionaires, there's a vicious attitude to people on benefits with sanctions, with 60 suicides now being investigated by the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions itself. We've got a huge and widening gap between the rich and the rest of us. And we're moving towards a society where most will be living in 1930s conditions without support from the welfare state, while the rich are living in luxury. Now, our main policies are, firstly, to reverse all public sector cuts, including to the NHS, which must be expanded and fully publicly owned and run service. Free education for all, 0 university tuition fees. £10 per hour minimum wage now. Build 1 million homes, and for those who are not going to go into those, institute rent controls immediately. End the bedroom tax and benefits actions, and for the reasons David has given, totally oppose TTIP. Now, where's the money coming from? Mr. Scully said we're the Magic One party. Well, I'll tell you, we'll nationalise the banks, we'll renationalise energy, so that's how we'll stop them putting the prices up, because you can't control what you don't own. Somebody told me that a long time ago. We'll renationalise rail, the post and water. We'll release the 600 billion that the major corporations are sitting on, that they've not invested anywhere. Chase up 120 billion pounds unpaid tax. I think that's been in the news. We will 100 billion pounds from Trident. The big 4 property developments have enough to build cash to build 1.4 million homes, and the councils have 24,000 hectares of greenfield land, and we will not pay the PFI £60 billion owed.
Thank you, Pauline. And lastly, for UKIP, Angus Dalgleish.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm a consultant physician at St George's Hospital and also a professor in the medical school, So you may ask, why on earth am I bothering to stand as your candidate for UKIP? And the reason being is that in the course of my work, it's become very clear that we're being prevented from doing our jobs because of what, when you dig underneath, are European Union directives that have been ill thought through and unfortunately implemented by our government. Every other government in the European Union seems to select them. The first one of it, which affected my job, so I was very, very angry about this, European Union Clinical Trial Directive. I was told I could no longer do the clinical trials I was doing unless I did it to a standard that required £2 million a study. And then I found that we were unable to look after our patients properly. The standard of care in the NHS has really deteriorated due to the European Working Time Directive. And that means nobody's allowed to work more than 48 hours, or there has to be a very good reason. This has caused unbelievable pandemonium in delivering care in the NHS. And you can promise, the other parties can promise all they like, that they'll do this, they'll do that, they'll provide more doctors, more nurses. It doesn't matter. Until you address these directives, it is all a complete waste of time. And this made me realise that it is the European Union that is the problem. We joined up as the European Free Trade Association and have very good trade arrangements and everything like that. But over the years, it has morphed into a multi-monster hydra. It has really become the most criminal, corrupt organisation that apart probably from Russia's Putin. I mean, and I'm not over-exaggerating when I say this. Everybody says, but it doesn't matter, it's all for the common good. If we get out of the European Union, we'll lose this, we'll lose that. So I get up every morning, I scan all the newspapers, and I was staggered to read this from the City AM, normally totally pro-EU. It says, leaving the European Union would be a win-win situation for the UK. Forget the scaremongering that so often accommodates debate about Britain's EU membership. Leaving the EU would be a win-win for the UK. We'd have more international influence, create more trade and jobs, and regain sovereign control over our own laws and borders. I thought I was reading the UKIP policy pamphlet, and this was an editorial in City AM. So what I'm telling you is that first and foremost, what UKIP wants is to withdraw from the EU, to have a referendum. Having it in 2017 is too late because they don't really want to do that. We have to have the European referendum, get out of Europe, and then basically have our own laws, control our own borders, and become our own country back again. Thank you.
Well, you've now heard each of the candidates speak in their 2 to 3 minutes, opening the hustings, and we now have questions, I'll remind you, which are to be asked only of one person, and I will name the person that you go for in turn, alphabetically by surname as far as the order goes, and the time limit, to remind you, will be an absolute limit of 3 minutes, again, between 2 and 3 minutes for each candidate anyway. And now, are there any questions for Dave Ash? Gentleman at the front.
Dave, I'd be very interested to hear what was it that made you decide to stand for Parliament?
Thank you for the question. What made me decide was a funny thing, actually. I found myself spending a lot of time shouting at the television and very angry when I was hearing news about the way that our NHS was being ripped up. And I could see that my kids were going to have to grow up without the benefits of an NHS. And me and my missus were talking, and I said, someone ought to do something about this. And I realised, actually, maybe it was time for me to stand up and do something about it. So that's what inspired me to stand, because I couldn't stand by and watch it happen without doing anything. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes, gentleman there.
Yes, National Health. I'm a patient of the National Health. I've been a diabetic for about 50 years. I have wonderful service. I've got no complaints, and I think the negatives that are put out by people like you and others, the negatives, we have a wonderful service and it costs a lot of money. I had one injection just recently, £235. I asked the value of it. I don't think we pay enough for our health service. I have wonderful service. I have cancer and it's being treated. But, sorry, can't complain.
Thank you.
I think actually you might find that we agree on a lot more than perhaps you imagine. I personally think that the NHS is the finest achievement of any nation ever. And that's why the corporate vultures are circling and they're trying to take it away from us. Yes, it's very expensive, but we deserve it. It's also the most efficient healthcare service in the developed world. That is a very good reason to stand up for it. I'm not here to knock the NHS by any stretch. I want to make that absolutely clear. I'm a big fan of the NHS.
Well, it doesn't sound that like to me.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions to Mr. Ash? We have time for one quick question and quick answer. Yes.
Are there any other authorities that agree with you about the destruction being done to the NHS? Or is it just you complaining about the NHS and running it down?
It's interesting you should ask that. Thank you. Actually, yes, the British Medical Association have fairly recently launched a big campaign calling for no more games. And when they say no more games, they mean political parties have got to stop using the NHS as a political football. Now, as came up in a previous Hustings event, where one of my colleagues on this panel actually said, oh, the NHS is a political football.
Very good.
If it is a football, that ball belongs to the people, and I believe we want our ball back.
Thank you. And now questions which are to be asked only of Emily Russ, the Labour Party candidate, please. Do I have a question for Emily? From anybody at all? Don't be shy of asking questions. Yes, there is somebody here.
Hi Emily. Emily, I wonder, you talked a lot in your introduction about change and things that you would like to see happen, but I wonder to what extent you as a member of the Labour Party feel that the current Labour Party leadership is really with you in terms of some of those changes that you would like to see that you talked about?
All my conversations with Ed Miliband and other members of the Shadow Cabinet lead me to strongly believe that Labour is committed as a movement to bringing about change, tackling austerity, investing in our NHS and in education. We have a plethora of policies which have all been costed so that we can move into government with clear approaches to make changes right across the piece in terms of what we want to achieve for people. That's a shared recovery in terms of economics. It's about building 200,000 homes every year in the next Parliament to 1 million. It's about regulating the energy market. It's also, as part of that cost of living crisis, dealing with private rented tenure so people have more security in terms of introducing vocational baccalaureate. There are whole sweeping things that we in Labour want to achieve, and I believe we will deliver, and our Shadow Cabinet believe we will deliver from the 8th of May. That's what we're committed to do.
We have time for another question for Emily Carruthers. Is there anybody in the rest of the body of the hall who would like to put a question? The gentleman just behind you there with the green t-shirt. Yeah, you.
Just on the subject of anti-austerity, getting that phrase quite a lot. To reduce our debts, though, are Labour proposing that we borrow more money to get us out of the deficit we have? So there's no anti-austerity, but what's the alternative to austerity? Is it to borrow more money, as Labour have done in the previous regime?
Only quarter of a minute.
We will bring down the deficit in the Parliament, we will tackle the national debt, we have all our proposals fully costed, we will not be borrowing more like this coalition have borrowed £207 billion more than it planned to in 2010. So on that basis, no, and we are also very concerned with a Conservative government being elected, that we will see cost of living go to 1930s levels. In fact, something like 35.2% of GDP will be the proportion of public spending that will have a serious impact on service delivery, health services, education, right across the board. And that is something that Labour will not do.
Thank you. We now have 3 minutes for questions to Paul Burstow. Do I have a question? Yes, gentleman here first.
Yeah, Paul, my question is to do about your claims related to St Heliers and also health service generally. What you said, and the government said, we invested £2.5 billion or something like that in the national NHS in the last 5 years. At the same time, the public don't know that £20 billion efficiency savings imposed in the NHS. They gave up £8 billion and nobody's talking about it. As you know, the real fate of St Heliers lies with the South West London Commissioning Group. And they have to make savings of £360 million in the coming 5 years, whatever. That's a figure. And the CCG is to make a savings of 200 million. Now, how can you, under those kind of figures that we have, ever claim that you will save St Heliers? Because St Heliers is under threat at the moment, it's got a deficit. So please, can you explain to the public, how can you tell us whether you can defend St Heliers and the services there? Because I was treated as St Heliers, I'm passionately committed to its defence. I want you to give me a credible answer to this under those conditions, please. Thank you.
So let's just start with the productivity and efficiency pressures that the NHS has been under in the last 5 years. Back in 2008, the last Labour government, through the Chief Executive of the NHS, set a target of between 15 and 20 billion being efficiency savings over 4 years. That goal was extended to be achieved over 5 years, and the NHS has performed remarkably well in terms of delivering on those efficiency savings, which have then been reinvested into the National Health Service. But, and it's an important but, that can only go so far. And we had in the autumn last year an autumn statement in which we committed as a government an additional 2 billion starting from this April as a down payment on delivering a plan that was set out by the NHS itself to both modernise and improve services. And one of the things that was said in that 5-year forward view was that by 2020 there will be a £30 billion funding gap in the National Health Service. It identifies further changes that can make some of that gap go away, but it recognised that there will be a need to raise additional revenues for the National Health Service. Goes to the point that was being made by the gentleman earlier on about do we pay enough for our National Health Service? And the answer to that question is no, we don't. And we need to be prepared in future to put more money in. And it's why we've said as a party that we will fund the £8 billion gap. We've identified the tax changes that we would make. We would not have as many reliefs that currently exist for capital gains tax. We would not continue with a particular shares for rights scheme that was introduced, which we think is not an effective way of using public money. And we would also grow the spend on the NHS in line with growth in the economy after 2018, once we've addressed the issue of the deficit. And that brings me back to the local situation. And you mentioned the fact that Epsom St Heliers has a deficit. It's had a deficit over these 5 years. That deficit has actually gone down year on year, and they are forecasting that the deficit will come to an end in the next year. And as a result of that, we'll be able to move to what is called Foundation Trust status, which is a mark of the fact that they are financially viable and delivering great care as well. And that seems to me to be a rather good outcome, and is why I'm confident we can campaign and maintain our local services.
And next are questions specifically for Angus Dalgleish, representing UKIP. Yes, the lady there. Sorry, could you perhaps move into the aisle and speak as loudly as you can and shout? Could you come forward, please, and we have a microphone that you can use.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about the three-parent embryo that was recently put through by the Conservative government. It's going to be extremely expensive, but apart from that, and most importantly, it's had an awful lot of study, a lot of research has been done. The United States of America have refused to have anything to do with that, and other European countries as well. And I'd just like to find out what the UKIP policy is on that, and also about the H2 Vanity Project, if you've got time to talk about that.
Well, thank you. Keep the questions fairly brief.
I'll answer
that's going to cost again.
No, I'll answer the first.
Thank you.
I'll answer the second one first. We've made our feelings very clear. The HS2 is an unbelievable vanity project. It's going to cost 50 billion at the moment. We know jolly well it'll be 70, 80 billion by the time it's finished. With regards to your first question, I don't think it's something we should take up time with UKIP. I'm a scientist, I have studied this very, very carefully, and I'm very unhappy about it, and I haven't made my mind up on it. I basically, at the moment, have yet to be convinced. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, gentlemen, there. To Angus Dalgleish.
Is it true that the European accounts haven't been signed off for the last 20 years or so? The auditors cannot agree that... you know what I'm talking
about? I know exactly what he's talking about. The European Union is now so corrupt and so full of criminals that nobody in their right mind can sign off the accounts. They haven't been signed off ever since it started. For the last 20 years, they've used KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, you name it. The last budgets were about £5 billion. I actually know one of my friends is in PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has actually spent the last few months in Brussels auditing it. He found 8.8 billion is missing. And he said what the really big problem is, nobody cares. Absolutely nobody cares. And it was in the paper, the Sunday Times, on page 3 at the top, just sort of giveaway line, 100 million awarded by one of the commissioners to his own company, and there was no checks or anything. It is the biggest corrupt cesspit going, which is why we have to pull out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. And questions next to Pauline Gorman, please. Just to Pauline Gorman, do I have questions? And if you could speak loudly and clearly from the back, please.
Good evening. My name's Simon Dingsley. I'm paying off a mortgage. I've been paying it off in the local area for about 12 years or so. We've got a piece of land. We're at the moment looking at maybe doing an extension, maybe an annex that we can rent out. At the moment, in this country, we have a lot of problems with lack of housing. That's pushing rents up and house prices up. Now, we've done the maths. We've looked at how much it's going to cost us to borrow to build this, with the idea that we'll be able to rent it out and more or less make our money back. And you talked about rent controls. If you put in rent controls, and I know there are other ways of looking at rent controls as well, the maths goes out the window. We'll not be able to make the money back. We'll lose money. We'll lose our house. And that means we can't go ahead and do this. So basically, the situation is, you bring in things like rent controls will actually cause the opposite of what you want to create. You will stop people building houses because they can't make money back from those houses. So, do you honestly think that that's a good way to encourage house building?
Thank you. Rent controls.
Okay, the policy is actually not for private building of houses. It is for public, for reinstating, if you like, the council housing programme that happened before. Now, 40% of private tenants' income in this country goes on rent. That is totally unacceptable figure. That leaves many people actually with very little disposable income, and that actually was the reason why the teacher was going into the food bank, because, and I've got a minute now to fill you in, because she was a supply teacher. Now, the local authorities used to have a bank of supply teachers, but now it's run by private private agencies. And by the way, privatisation, a little known happenstance of privatisation is that the wages are driven down. And I know that because I go to Carshalton Leisure Centre and the Westcroft Leisure Centre, and they tell me there that since it was tendered out, their wages have dropped dramatically. And that was what happened to this teacher. The private companies providing supply teachers now for forcing the teachers to become self-employed, and when she went on maternity leave, she did not have any maternity pay from them. And so when she finished her maternity leave, she was short of nappies and food, and she went to the food bank. That's a disgrace. It's a total and utter disgrace in this country, because this is a wealthy country. And if you want to go ahead, my party has nothing against you as a private landlord, but your rent must not be 40% of your tenant's income. It must be a much, much lower figure. And
so you want to control it?
That is, yes, it must be. I remember when we had controlled rents, and I remember when we had controlled rents. Rents in London are going through the roof, and that is the result. You have people who cannot afford to pay them. You're also going to lose a whole section of public sector workers if we're not careful, because of the way housing is provided in Greater London.
Thank you. And I now invite questions specifically to be put to Paul Scully, the Conservative candidate. Do I have a question? Yes, in the brown anorak, please. The brown jacket. Yes.
In view of the division of wealth in this country, as illustrated by the numbers of Conservative Party millionaire members of David Cameron's cabinets in the last Parliament, as compared, on the other hand, with the increasing numbers resorting to food banks, can you please outline Conservative Party policies that will benefit the less well-off members of society and not the traditional supporters amongst the wealthy and big business? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question, putting millionaire people in Parliament next to people that are striving to get on in life in their everyday fields outside politics, because there are people of all sorts of backgrounds in the House of Parliament, of all parties, millionaires on all parts of the all parties, and people that have worked their way through mining, bus driving, all sorts. But coming back to your specific question about policies, we've actually taken a number of people out of tax entirely by raising the tax threshold with which they do. It's something that's been implemented over the last 5 years with a Conservative Chancellor that's put in, and we want to extend that to £12,000. What we've also done is we've helped to start fixing the economy, frankly. Because by fixing the economy, as I said in my introductory remarks, we've created more jobs than the whole of the rest of Europe put together. Yorkshire itself has created more jobs than France. So we've actually started to rebuild a situation where people can actually feel confident that there are jobs out there for them, that they can get on and strive to get on in life. We've also changed the welfare system so that it always pays to work as well, so that we have a situation where you can have a hand up, but not necessarily a hand out. It's really important that in doing so, that we make sure that we're looking after the most vulnerable in our society, but as I say, making sure that it's not something that becomes a lifestyle choice, as it has for a small but significant minority.
We have time for one more quick question. Gentleman in the blue at the back.
Mr. Cameron often claims his policies are not saddling our children with debt. In 2010, Professor Victoria Chicken and Pettiford examined 100 years of UK economic evidence and found that austerity or cuts has never reduced the national debt. Indeed,
could you keep your question very brief, please? We have much time.
Now, the Office for National Statistics say that public sector debt has actually increased 50% since May 2010 under coalition austerity policies, just under £1.5 trillion. Why are Tories going to carry on increasing austerity?
Well, actually, because we inherited a massive deficit. So the deficit, massive, very easy to answer the difference between deficit and debt. Deficit means that we are actually spending more money than we raise, and we are still trying to get over that problem at the moment. When we took over government in 2010, £1 in every 4 that was spent by the government was borrowed money. That was money that was actually coming to fund Chinese universities, Middle Eastern healthcare, not our public services as well. We've tried to rectify that situation now, and once we've sorted that, until we've sorted out the deficit, yes, of course, simple maths means that the debt will go up until we can have a surplus.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, are there any questions? I'm sure there are, specifically to Maeve Tomlinson for the Green Party. Do I have a question for Maeve Tomlinson? Yes, the gentleman here.
The HS2 has already been described as a vanity project. Would the Green Party agree with that? And how do they feel that so much transport infrastructure is concentrated in London, particularly with Crossrail and now Crossrail 2 and other projects? Could you talk how the Green Party would perhaps distribute the funding elsewhere?
Did you hear that clearly?
Distribute funding elsewhere.
HS2 and...
Yeah.
Tell us what
the
question was about.
The question is about the Green Party's policy on HS2 and the concentration of transport spending in London, mostly.
We want to, because at the moment the railways are being privatised, and we want to return the railways back into public hands to stop profits being put before passengers. And by doing this, we'll be able to introduce an immediate cut in fares of 10%, which will give passengers a much needed financial break. With those kind of policies, we'll be able to redistribute funding of transport further around the country as well. And also with our other policies that will decrease sort of inequality by sort of taxing the wealthiest, we'll be able to have more funds to spread into other projects to make to improve the infrastructure with transport elsewhere.
Thank you. If I'm not dazzled looking at my watch, we have time for one, or possibly two more questions to Maeve. Yes, gentleman here in the black.
Yeah, apparently next year the Trident nuclear weapons is up for renewal. Can you tell us where the Green Party stands on this, and if they're against it, how much money could be saved?
Okay, the Green Party would like to scrap Trident because it would save like £100 billion. This is a lot of money that could be distributed elsewhere. And what was the other bit? So we would scrap it and...
Just how much money could be saved?
We'd save £100 billion if we managed to scrap. Because it's just a vanity project, really. It was 25 years ago that there was the Cold War, and now the threats to defence our threats to the country have changed, and it's all to do with more like cyber terrorism that we should be investing in rather than nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the questions addressed separately to candidates. We now have questions where everyone will have a shot. Can I ask people please to keep questions as brief as possible? We're approximately keeping to time, but we need to continue to do that. If the question does go on for a very long time, be warned I may cut you off to speak loudly and clearly, and we'll get through several, I'm sure. and I will ask candidates in an order that they don't know yet to answer the question that's put each time. And I would ask each candidate, please, to keep your answer to about a minute at the most, no more than a minute. We have a lot of candidates. First question, please. Yes, gentlemen here.
With a budget deficit of 90 billion and savings of 50 billion needed by 2019-20, the politicians seeking our votes owe it to all taxpayers to come clean about what spending the country can afford. That is, of course, if they do go along with that. I think some of the people would like to spend a lot more on this platform. For every cut that the party is proposing, there seems to be far more promises of higher spending and protection of certain favoured departmental budgets. Can the candidates spell out what is proposed by way of cuts, the amount involved, and the departmental heading under which they fall?
Thank you, Paul Burstow.
Right, the answer to your question, sir, is the approach that we want to take is to depart from the position that the Conservatives now want to take, and we want to adopt a position which says you have to balance the way in which you deal with the deficit over the next 5 years. In other words, you have partly to meet it through continuing spending reductions on some departments, and we've indicated the departments we want to protect, as you rightly say in your question, but also by tax changes as well. We believe that there is a legitimate case for saying that the wealthiest part of our society should be contributing through such changes as capital gains tax, additional revenues to the Exchequer. But we also think that the work that we've started during this Parliament, where we've seen a tenfold increase in the amount that we are getting back through tax evasion, in other words, preventing tax evasion succeeding, needs to carry on so that we can raise up to 6 billion extra revenue a year to contribute to the deficit reduction programme in the next 3 years. We want to get the deficit down by 2018. That's our goal.
Thank you. Pauline, Gorman.
Yes, we do want to spend more, actually. The post-war national debt was twice what it is today in real terms, and yet we saw then the founding of the NHS, the actual setting up of the welfare state, and we had free prescriptions, free dental work, all these gains that have actually been taken now away from us. And I think I outlined where we're going to get the money, from. We are going to take over the financial institutions. There are billions of pounds that are actually have not been collected in tax. I remember actually when they wrote off the 6 billion, that Vodafone, they just wrote off their £6 billion tax debt. Consistently, right up till now, the tax has not been collected from the wealthy, but much less wealthy people have been totally hounded. That's one thing, and I think I outlined before.
Thank you. Next, Dave Ash.
Education and health are fiscal multipliers. That is to say, for health, for example, every pound we spend on healthcare yields an approximate £4 return to GDP. That's a no-brainer for me. You spend a bit of money on it, people are more productive when they're healthy. Tax avoidance and evasion is estimated to be over £100 billion every year. So I don't think for a moment that you would ever recover all of that, but if you could get a significant chunk of that back by going after people who are avoiding taxes, that would certainly help. And another thing that I would mention is that we've got an awful lot of PFI deals which are costing us a small fortune, and in many cases those PFI deals are with banks that we as taxpayers now own. So I say we need to go and renegotiate those contracts for something that's approaching a realistic interest rate. Thank you.
Paul Scully.
We've ring-fenced the NHS budget over the last 5 years, and that's something we intended to do over the next 5 years as well, putting £2 billion extra in each year. The school's budget as well is looking at being protected. The Conservative manifesto will be out next week, I believe, so we'll have more detail at that point of the specific departments you talk about. But it's really important, as I say, that we get to a point, as quickly as we can, that Britain can live within its means. We've heard some fantastical claims about where the money's going to come from and how much we're going to be spending if some of these parties get in at the moment. You would think you're in Mugabe's land grab, actually, that the fact that you can suddenly take over half the institutions of this country. The financial institutions that apparently we're all going to be taking over contribute, I think it's 11% of the entire tax stake of this country. They won't be here to be grabbed, frankly. We have to live in reality and actually turn our deficit into a surplus as fast as possible to pay for our debts. Thank you.
And next, Angus Dalgleish for UKIP.
UKIP are the only people who have actually thought this through. We had actually saved 9 billion by getting out of the EU. That is what we pay, 55 million a day for absolutely nothing. Or if you pay 9 billion in, you get 1 billion back. Complete waste of time. We would then look at the foreign aid budget, which they all signed up to, going to be 14 billion next year. There's an independent report here basically showing that 80% of it is completely wasted and goes to corrupt regiments. We would then look at what the big independent report said and the real cost of being in the European Union to small businesses was. Even I didn't believe it was this big. It was £33 billion is the cost of red tape and EU directives to small businesses. By getting out of that and regulating it ourselves, it's another 33 billion. It goes on and on. That's over 50 billion straight away. So we would be able to fund the NHS and all the various things. It gets worse, or it gets better. Tim Condon's looked at it. He was the chief economist to Gordon Brown, till he realised he was mad. And he's shown that there's over 100 billion could be saved a year by getting out of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Maeve Tomlinson.
We do have enough money. We are the sixth richest country in the world, and yet we have the highest inequality in the Western world, as I mentioned before. So there's ways that we can redistribute that money. And one way is for a wealth tax on the top 1%. Those with assets of more than 3 million affects about 300,000 people in the UK. Taxing the assets of the wealthiest at a rate of between 1 and 2% would raise approximately 21 billion to 43 billion a year. And the Robin Hood tax on the banks, taxing transactions, closing tax loopholes so that company profits earned in the UK were taxed here, and a progressive income tax. We would introduce a new higher rate of income tax at 50% for incomes above 100,000 per annum. And our sort of fully costed manifesto will be out in about a week's time as well, if you want to
Thank
more
you, Emily.
figures.
You could draw to a close. And on that note, we come finally to Emily Brothers.
Thank you. In fact, it's not £50 billion that would bring about public spending cuts, but since the autumn statement, the Office of Budget Responsibility has said that the current plans would bring about £70 billion of public spending cuts. Labour have undertaken a zero budget review across all departments, and they recommend changes. So, for example, in terms of the Home Office, we will cut police and crime commissioners. That will save £500 million. So all those cuts to waste and efficiency savings are going to accumulate. Labour have also costed all of our proposals. So in terms of the NHS, time to care fund will come from a mansion tax on properties of over £2 million. We will reintroduce the 50p tax rate, and that will be about sharing the burden more fairly across people in society. So we are looking at balancing that.
Well, those are the candidates' answers to the first question, and I now invite a second question from the audience. and this is for everybody to have a shot at. And I think that the gentleman there with the open-necked shirt had stood up before, so yes, please. Yeah.
According to the statistical studies, austerity has actually cost 5% of GDP across growth over the past, about £4,000 per household. Why does the Burstow Party support such a disastrous, incompetent economic policy?
Thank you. Question for everybody, beginning with Emily Brothers this time, on austerity and the large amount it has cost every single household in the country. Why is Mr. Burstow particularly supporting it?
Okay. Cost of living crisis is hitting people here in Sutton and Cheam every day. We've already heard about food banks, but in terms of the loss of real term wages for the average family, £1,600, people are worse off, families are worse off. In terms of reduction in real terms in terms of tax and tax credits and benefits, families are £1,167 worse off since 2010. They are the effects of cost of living, and it having a real impact on people paying their energy bills, their food bills. For example, the coalition said they wouldn't bring up VAT, the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. That's precisely what they did do. And they haven't ruled it out for another parliament if they are elected again. And that has a real impact on working families. So when they say they're not going to increase VAT, well, look at their record, because that's what they may well do.
Thank you. David.
I've noticed that since 2010, poor people have got poorer and rich people have got a lot richer. Every major party represented on this panel insists on continuing austerity. Well, I say it has to stop. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Next, Maeve Tomlinson. I'm sorry for getting your name wrong before.
Oh, that's okay.
Maeve Tomlinson.
Yeah. The Green Party wishes to end austerity because it disproportionately affects the poorest and the most vulnerable. We will end austerity and invest in the public sector because shrinking the size and quality of public services through austerity is an effective redistribution of income. People with lower incomes rely much more on public services than people with high incomes. And in the UK, the richest 10% own 70% of total wealth, and the great majority of the income gains from the crisis have gone to the wealthier. Living standards are also declining with food banks. 900,000 people relied on food banks for food in 2013 to 2014, up from 100,000 in 2011 to 2012. And despite GDP growth over the last decade, the poorest tenth of the population have seen a fall in their real income.
Thank you. Pauline Gorman.
Right, so-called austerities has been used as an excuse to freeze public sector pay, make cuts and hand benefits recipients. But it hasn't been that way for everybody. The RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, that we own 84% in, had a 3.5 billion loss, but we have paid out £421 million in bonuses to the chiefs of that bank. So TUSC would end austerity. We would end the climate of austerity. We would reverse the cuts.
Right, thank you, Pauline. Next, Paul Scully.
I think we just need to go back to where we were in 2010 and revisit that, and remember when Liam Byrne, the Treasury Minister then, left a message in the Treasury saying there is no more money. We were actually in a situation as a country where we were in a similar economic situation to Italy, which has had a Prime Minister imposed on them by a technocrat Prime Minister by Europe, and Greece. And we've actually managed to restore confidence in the markets, restore the confidence in the economy, and are working our way to a budget surplus later on in this decade. But when we talk about track record, you only have to go again back to Ed Miliband. It's like listening to Ed Miliband is like the sort of arsonist that sets a fire to something and complains about the colour of the fire engine when it's coming in the opposite direction to try and put the fire out. You know, we've had no money when we took over in 2010, and we're restoring confidence in that. Just trying to fancy up, create some of these savings and say we're not going to have any cuts over the next few years is fanciful at best.
Thank you. And now, Angus Dalgleish.
Well, I think you ought to be fully aware that the austerity we have in this country is absolutely nothing compared to the austerity imposed by the vanity, stupid project of the euro. Implementing the euro has caused unbelievable poverty. 50% of people under the age of 30 in Greece, Spain and Italy are without a job or just scraping for a living, living with their parents. This thing has been absolutely dire. It's only because we kept out of it, against the wishes of Tony Blair, who's resurrected again like some monster to remind us all of this, that we actually have less than austerity everywhere else. And that's why everybody wants to come and join us. That's why our economy is actually starting to grow, because we stayed out of the euro. And just one last thing, if we now get out of the European Union directives, we'll do even better.
Thank you. All those.
Yes, and it is an important question. It's the key question really of the election, how we make sure we have an economy that is growing and strong and able to generate the wealth and the jobs that we and our families want. But I refute entirely the proposition which was that we should not have been involved in dealing with the deficit. Deficit reduction is absolutely central to having a stable economy and allowing the economy to recover. If we had not formed a stable government in 2010, we would have gone the way of some of our European neighbours in terms of the economic mess that they have had to deal with. I want to make two other points, if I may. One is that there is this myth that somehow the last Labour government taxed the rich more than this coalition. The reality is only in 1 year did the last Labour government actually tax richer people at a higher rate than this coalition government has actually done. And when it comes to dealing with issues of tax evasion, this coalition government, because of Liberal Democrat ministers in it promoting this particular cause, have increased by tenfold the amount that's recovered from people avoiding tax. And of course we've managed to deliver a £10,000 tax threshold, which has put more money back in people's pockets.
Thank you. That's the end of the second question. Bearing in mind the desire on everybody's part, I'm sure, for variety in the questions, could I now ask for a third question for each candidate to answer in turn? Yes. Loud and clear.
As we voted for one of you, I'd like to ask a more personal question, which is what guides your personal morality and what happens when your personal morality is at odds with your party line?
Good question. Thank you. I think everybody would have heard that. That was what guides you in terms of personal morality in your politics and your life. Maeve Tomlinson.
Well, the reason that I chose to join the Green Party, because I felt their policies were in line with what I was campaigning for locally with the campaign groups that I'm in, and so I wasn't finding any issues with morality, because I chose a party so that there was a match to what I believed in and what I want to do to make a better society. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul Scully.
I think in terms of what guides me, it would be my upbringing, my family, my 46 years of 47 years in a couple of weeks' time of working with people, dealing with people, family, friends, work colleagues, etc. And in terms of politics, I think the reason that I actually became a Conservative in the first place is because some of the discussions that we had today. I think it's the only party, frankly, that includes the human nature in its policies. We can come up with some fantastic theories, but we have to deal with 60 million odd individuals in this country and work out how best to chart a course through the problems that we face and the opportunities that arise. In terms of how I would deal with conflict, I think that would be a tough one, because obviously I would love to think that people are voting solely for me, but I obviously know there's a national picture as well and a national government. But I would hope that I would have the strength and resolve to work out between my own views and the representing a constituents here the right path.
Thank you. Angus Dalgleish.
I've thought about this very hard over the years, and I can put it very simply, and that is, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Ash.
It's a very good question, actually, and I'm grateful for it. The NHA will not have a party whip, so providing our policies are adhered to by all of the candidates, they're content for us to take free rein on anything that's not. As Maeve said, I joined the NHA because I believe that they have the right policies for all of us, in particular in regard to the NHS, but on a wider level as well. We don't have any big corporate sponsors, so none of us will be marching to the tune of those corporate sponsors. I'm only really in this because I believe it's the right thing to do. I'm not a career politician. I've never in the past wanted to be a politician, but I thought someone ought to stand up and defend our NHS. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Burstow.
Well, you don't join the Liberal Democrats and expect a big political career. You certainly don't expect to become a Member of Parliament, and you certainly don't expect to become a Minister. So it was about the values of the party that I chose to join. I was motivated by people like Shirley Williams, who I believe is a great politician. And when it comes to those tough decisions that often are free votes in Parliament, then there are a whole range of factors that come into my mind, not least my Christian faith. And that does require me sometimes to reflect and quite often struggle between what different Christians think is the right answer to a question. And one of the things I've learned in the 18 years I've been a Member of Parliament when I've been addressing issues of conscience is that there is not always a single right answer. There is not always a uniquely Christian answer to a question, whether it be same-sex marriage, where there are Christians on both sides of the argument, and I hope that they can respect each other's points of view. I sided with those who said monogamy and loving relationships should be celebrated, and we should have and allow same-sex marriages. And I'd love to give the answer to the embryo question, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about that later, because I think that's a very important issue too.
Emily Brothers.
I grew up in a working class family in Liverpool and went to a Catholic boarding school, and that experience stays with me today. Let me just tell you a brief story. I supported today the Read On, Get On campaign, and I did that because I learned to reread at the age of 10 again, learning Braille, because of my eyesight being lost. And that is why I'm passionate about education, about mainstreaming education. That's also because of eye operation as a child that I am committed to the NHS. That personal experience has stayed with me. And part of that reading campaign was that it gave me the tools to go on in terms of education and a career and participate and to strive for equality for me, for my family, and also for other people. Civil rights legislation, improved benefits and living conditions for other disabled people. Sharing, that is what is important to me.
Thank you. And lastly, Pauline Gorman.
I come from a family where part of it had been involved for a long time in peace and trade union activity. And as a teenager, I joined the CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and I still support that. I believe then in the mixed economy, much as the four main parties do. But then I saw the Labour Party clause 4 to take into public ownership the commanding heights of the economy, and then I realised that would be so people would benefit, not bosses. But sadly, Harold Wilson did not end the UK intervention in the Vietnam War, and he made me join, well, that's the reason why I joined the Socialist Party. It was his fault. And then after having been in the Labour Party for about 30 years, Tony Blair dropped the clause 4 and I left the Labour Party, or the Labour Party left me. TUSC has no interest in joining the Millionaires Club, and TUSC MPs will take only the average wage. They will not take the 67,000.
Thank you. And that's the end of the third question. So a fourth question. Everybody have a shot at the gentleman with the beard there near the aisle. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Many young people, my age, a bit younger, are quite disillusioned by politics. A lot of us voted Liberal Democrat at the last election in the hope that tuition fees would be ended, if not just reduced, only to be betrayed. How are the candidates, how are they going to try and regain the trust of so many young people in our society?
How would the candidates regain the trust of young people in our society, many of whom might have been particularly disappointed over university tuition fees? And the first to answer, please, Angus Dalgleish.
Well, I think the first thing to regain the trust of politics is to actually tell the truth and not to misguide and mislead all the time on major issues and then do the opposite of what you say when you get in. So I really believe that what I say the basic core thing about getting out of the European Union is the number one thing, and it actually affects everything else. And when you look at it, we would then look at exactly what goes on in Europe, what the costs are of higher education, etc. Because in some places it is actually an awful lot cheaper. But I would not actually, if I got in tomorrow, advocate cutting the fee from 9,000 to 6,000, as the Labour Party has said, because we've looked through into that, and that will actually cause an awful lot of problems without thinking through something better over the next 5 years. And I mean that because we have looked at it, because it's such an attractive thing to say.
Thank you. Next, Paul Burstow.
Politics is often about compromise, and those compromises often take place within political parties. We know during the last Labour government there were many compromises and many rows between those within that government. Those rows have been made more obvious because we've had a coalition for the last 5 years, and that coalition has had to make compromises. One of the ones that we have had to make, and which we are and have paid a price for, has been the tuition fee changes. But it's worth just noting that the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that has been referred to as a very eminent source of facts on a number of occasions this evening, has described the changes that the coalition has brought in as being more progressive than the system that it replaced. And I would urge people to look at the work that Martin Lewis has done, which sets out why so many of these things are myths rather than facts when it comes to the changes we've made. And when it comes to issues around dissolution with politics, I think the thing that most disturbed me and caused me to be concerned about politics and the state of politics goes back to a decision that was made for this country to enter in a war in Iraq on the basis of very little evidence, and I think that did more to diminish politicians and the view that people have of us.
Pauline Gorman.
Right, for many youth today the prospects are very bleak, but TUSC has much to offer young people. Firstly, the £10 minimum wage. Secondly, we would set up real paid proper apprenticeships. Thirdly, we would end internships, which are either exploitative or only open to the wealthy. We would put a complete end to 0 hours contracts, and we would reopen any closed youth centres and ensure more are developed. And these would have proper IT facilities. I have actually seen one, but drove past one, with proper IT facilities, proper cafe facilities, and an ongoing education programme, but selected by the youth itself who attend those centres, and a social life, hopefully.
Thank you. And next, Maeve Tomlinson.
Yeah, the Green Party, one of our policies is actually to scrap tuition fees, and we also, our largest group is the Young Greens, who have increased membership by as many members as we had as a whole party last year. So they have a very strong voice within our party, and so I'd urge all young people to go out and vote Green, and so we can, so trust can be restored in politicians, and we can guide the future according to according to the Young Voice.
Thank you. And next, Emily Brothers.
Labour has a better plan for young people. We will reduce tuition fees from £9,000 to £6,000. We will also bring in apprenticeships for school leavers who meet the basic grades. We will change the structure of education, the approach to education, by bringing in vocational baccalaureate and technical degrees. We will invest in teaching through master teaching qualifications. We'll also bring about a job guarantee scheme for young people. We will bring about also votes at 16 for young people, giving young people a role in our communities and broader society. In terms of broken politics, I think that has been due to many promises being broken, and the Liberal Democrats on VAT and tuition fees is an example. We learned from the Iraq War by standing against intervention in Syria. That demonstrates that Labour is able to learn and will continue to do so.
Dave.
On the question, amen. I absolutely agree with everything you've just said. Mr Burstow in 2010 in his literature said that people should vote for him to keep the Tories out. And since 2010, he's carried out every dastardly deed they've asked for. And he's saying it again. On tuition fees, they were introduced by Labour, and despite their pledge prior to the election, they were tripled by the coalition. I think that's unforgivable, actually. Education should be free. On the Syria vote, Mr Burstow actually voted yes and no, which is an interesting way of abstaining from a vote. And with the Clause 119 amendment that Mr Burstow submitted, I was at the meeting with Mr Burstow with 38 Degrees. He submitted an amendment, withdrew it, and then voted against his own amendment. So, yeah, I don't think that inspires a great deal of confidence, and that is a lot of the reason why I'm standing here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Paul Scully.
I won't go over some of the stuff that's been said now, but we've moved on from, what worries me, we've moved on from promises that are at risk of being broken. I think if you saw Martin Freeman's Labour Party political broadcast this week, when he was talking about guarantees, and we just heard it before, no idea how a government is going to guarantee you GP appointments, guarantee you apprenticeships. Who are you going to sue? What are you going to do about it? So that really worries me about when you're talking about trust, how that's going to be followed through. From a personal point of view, I like to under-promise and over-deliver. I like to take bite-sized chunks, things that I know I can actually tackle and make a difference in, rather than trying to change the world in a day, these sort of things. From a national point of view, we absolutely need a stable government. We've heard about coalitions and about promises that can be made and then thrown away behind closed doors. We really don't know. We're living in an unstable time. We're not sure what's going to happen in the election. But I come back to what I said right at the beginning, that the Conservatives need 23 more seats to win an outright majority, so we can have a stable government and we can keep to our manifesto promises.
No top-down real.
Thank you. We've had 4 questions. We can squeeze in a 5th, I think, if the candidates promise to be brief. And in fact, I'm going to be dastardly if anybody speaks for longer than half a minute on this one. A final question. You're invited to ask a question if you're at school or university or wherever, or third university. Anyway, we've got a range of people who would like to, gentlemen, there.
Would the candidates support the right of constituencies to hold a mini referendum to recall their MP if promises made in an election campaign be broken by
Would candidates support the right of recall of candidates who are deemed to have broken their promises? Pauline Gorman.
Yes, absolutely.
One agree. Thank you.
Immediate recall.
I didn't recall you, but wonderful. Angus Dalgleish.
It's UKIP policy.
Thank Thank you. Paul Scully.
I have a far stronger recall than there's been in this Parliament at the moment. I agree with the Zach Goldsmith amendments.
Good. Emily Brothers.
Yes, I support recall, and so does Labour Party.
Maeve Tomlinson.
Yes, I support recall, and so does the Green Party.
Paul Burstow.
So in our manifesto we had a commitment to introduce recall on the basis of serious offences. That's been implemented in this Parliament. I don't believe just having a referendum on a question that is simply about has a promise subjectively yes or no been broken does make sense, so I wouldn't support that.
Thank you. And finally, Dave Ash.
Yes, absolutely yes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is bang on 9:30, and the commercial break or something is no doubt about to happen, so that's the end of our time. Thank you to candidates for coming, and of course to all of you for supporting this, and I hope that it helps people make their decisions, or does whatever else they came here today to benefit from. So, good evening and goodbye.